So as some of you know, I have openly bashed Next.js and React on my channel. There's some things about Next.js and React I just don't like. I think sometimes the learning curve can be a little bit high just to kind of understand how React works. And then add on top of that, Next.js also is pretty complicated. I've talked about switching the remix. I've talked about switching from React to Vue. But ultimately, I always end up coming back to Next.js. And the reason from my perspective is the optionality that React and Next.js kind of provide. I do still think Next.js and React are king of this ecosystem. I like the idea of Next.js and React because their core thing that I've seen over the years is that they allow you to have optionality. What this means is that they don't dictate a lot of how you should do things. They give you these primitives that you can kind of use and interact with, which is kind of like a double-edged sword. Now, I say this is a double-edged sword because I came from AngularJS and Angular before I switched to React, and Angular had a nice conventional way of doing things. They had Protractor, this is the way you write your tests. RxJS, which is how you kind of do your like signals in a sense, like your observers and subscribers. And then you have like your built-in dependency injection and stuff. So every time you switch from one Angular project to another one, you had this very common knowledge or convention that you can kind of hit the ground running with. Also, it's written in TypeScript, which is great. Coming over from Angular to React, I feel like the ecosystem was just scattered everywhere, which is a bad thing because now you don't know the best way to do stuff, right? You have to kind of pick and choose, but that's good because it's actually more optionality. I guess it allows more frameworks and libraries to kind of compete and build off of each other. And then the best one kind of ends up being used by everyone. So I remember back when I started with React, there was like so many different ways you can do state management. There's like Redux, Zustan, Jodi, Redux Toolkit came out at some point, Context came out, and it was kind of a mess. I think if you look at it with a silver lining, like we just have more options, which is really good. I think Theo also talks about this a lot. I'm not trying to just copy off what he's saying, but I want to kind of talk about optionality in terms of Next.js and why I still think Next.js is a really great framework because I think they did the optionality part pretty well. So for those of you who have been using Next for a while, the first approach that we had was the pages router, right? So if you wanted to make a page, you can name the page basically to match the route. And in here, you can just go ahead and say export default function my page and just return a div that says like hello world. Now, the reason this released the optionality is because when Next came out with the app router, they didn't force you to switch over to it, right? They allowed you to kind of opt into it. You can slowly upgrade into it. So if I go to my main page, you'll see the app router come up. And if I say other, you will see that other page come up with hello world. So that's one demonstration of optionality, which is something that you should always keep in mind when you're building out libraries and frameworks and systems, because you want to have your consumers of your libraries not feel super locked in to what they're using, right? You want them to be able to pick and choose what they need, and usually just giving them basic primitives and allowing the community to build off of those is a much better solution. So the second demonstration of optionality with the app router is you might run into issues where you're pulling in third-party libraries that you used all the time with your single-page React application, and you get tons of errors. You get like weird hydration errors. You get issues with your components not working because you didn't put use client inside of those third-party libraries. No one's forcing you to do React server components, right? So you can just go ahead and put use client at the top of every single page. And this is going to basically work the way it has worked for a long time with like a single page React application with create React app or a Vite app. You don't have to worry about all this like React server component stuff, server actions. You just do stuff the old React way, which is great because now you can literally just start using the convention of the app router and not have to worry about bringing in some type of third-party routing system, which unfortunately that's another thing that the React didn't provide us. They didn't give us a way to do routing. So that's another sign of optionality, which I think is good. I think having a file-based routing system makes it much easier to map your mind from the URL that you're looking at here and finding that over here on the left with the actual file that represents that mapping. But technically, I think there's ways to basically just have a single index here with Next.js, and you could just import a router here, which inspects your URL and changes the view based on that. So you still have the option there, I believe. I think there's a way to use like React Router inside of Next.js if you want to. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that you can keep doing things the React way, right? So if I want to go ahead and just like make some data here, I'll say like use state. That's going to have an empty array. And then let's say you wanted to fetch some data when this component loads, right? So if you're a masochist and you don't want to use React Query, you can just go ahead and make a fetch request to, I don't know, some endpoint. So like HTTP my endpoint / v1 to-dos, and then we'll get a response back. get the JSON, and we'll say that data. So all of this still works, right? If I were to go ahead and just like print out data.hello or data of 0 of hello or something, this should still work. Let me just go ahead and put hello here. Now, obviously, this is a fake endpoint, so that's not going to fetch data. But you can do stuff the traditional React way, right? You can always dive down and do stuff on the client side of things if you need to. So this is still a good example of if you're still on the fence of like, do I want to actually couple my API inside of Next.js? Let's say you have a separate Go API and you want to have your client components fetch data from that Go API. You can still do stuff like this, right? And honestly, I feel sometimes doing stuff with like React query is actually a lot more, it's a better developer experience versus having to like dive into React server components and server actions and all this stuff. But you guys can be the judge of that. So the idea is, let's say, you know, you're building out a page and you're like, you know what? I actually don't mind having my API baked into React, bundled in as a monolithic application. So again, optionality, I can just go ahead and make an API here. I can make a folder called to-dos. And I can just go ahead and make a route.ts, go ahead and grab some stuff from their example here, and we can just return an array that says hello world with an exclamation mark. Okay, so then I've just opted in because there's optionality there. I opted in of just saying, you know what, I want to fetch to-dos, still doing this traditional React way from my own Next.js endpoint, and I'm going to display that. Let's go back here. Let's go to the main page. Oh, make sure I do API here. Forgot to do that. And there you have it. It says app router world with an exclamation mark. So you know that it's hitting the API that's provided by Next.js. But wait, there is more. Let's say you decide that, you know what, I don't want to have to wait for my user. If I were to go ahead and throttle this and say, make this super slow. If I load this page, notice that it shows app router world, but it's still over here like doing stuff, right? It hasn't actually made that XHR request to get that data to show world exclamation mark. You might say, you know what, because I'm on the landing page, I want to make this load with as much data as possible when that request first finishes, so that if I have like a web crawler that's crawling this UI, they can see all the keywords in text, start parsing it without having to wait for an additional JavaScript request to finish. Okay, so finally that finished. So again, you have the option of, you know what, I want to make this a React server component. I want to fetch this data before it returns data to the front end. So that search engine optimization might be a little bit better. And also because there's certain things that I just don't want to show spinners everywhere while it's trying to fetch this data. So then you can opt into that. Now, how do you opt into that? Well, let's go ahead and just delete use client. Pretty cool. And then I'm going to go ahead and just fetch directly from this API. I don't have to have an effect anymore. I don't have to have state anymore. I can just go ahead and say const data is equal to await this. And I'm going to put async here so I can actually do that await call. So now I've converted my client component to a server component. And that allows me to basically call promises and await on them and get that data back, so that when React runs through and tries to render out this page, it has access to all that data on the first pass through. So if I did this correctly, I should be able to refresh the page. Now, the way Next.js works is typically it doesn't know what location needs to fetch from this API. So usually you have like a next public API URL here. You can just kind of concatenate that. I'll say process env, so we can do that. And then let's just go ahead and make a .env file. And we're going to go ahead and set that equal to localhost 3000. Look at me doing concatenation like an old school Java developer. Let me go ahead and revert this to like look like that. I know my head's blocking it, but I mean, you get the point, right? So this is typically how you do it. And if you deploy to Vercel, like they'll have like an environment variable set for you. But the idea is that now all that data that you want for a web crawler or to like not have a bunch of loaders showing up, you just opted into that, right? No one's forcing you to write React server components. No one's forcing you to use fetch requests like this. That's a choice you kind of do when you decide that that's what the user experience needs to be for this particular page. Now, on top of that, there are some things that I don't like about Next.js, like the fact that they overwrote fetch, and this stuff is going to cache your data. There's ways to override the cache. You can say like no store and just say like, I never want this data to cache. That's probably one thing that has a very high learning curve, where you have to realize that some things are going to get cached when you're using it. All right, so now we're going to dive into areas of Next.js which I think are absolutely garbage. And we can kind of talk about it, and that is the caching, okay? The opting into caching is where they screwed up. They have basically said they're going to force you to cache everything, which I would rather opt in to caching. Like, again, going back to optionality, they have optionalities to turn it off. I just think they should have inverted it. I'd rather have the options to opt into it. And I'll show you why that's an issue right here. I'm going to go ahead and do an npm run build. And I want to show you two very important things that if you're first getting into Next.js, you might not realize, but these can cause some major issues and headaches when you're first trying to understand this. So when you do an npm run build, it tells you if it rendered the page as static or if it rendered it as a dynamic page. In our case, it's rendering this page as a static page. So what this means is that even though your API may return different information, it doesn't matter. It already generated this page right here. And if you go and you kind of like look at that page, it's going to have the same data every single time. You go to app and then go to like index.html, you will see world exclamation mark basically hard coded into this HTML, and that's going to basically be there forever. So then if you scroll up, you'll see that API/to-dos is also rendered as static, which means that if you have a user who goes to API/to-dos, what exactly does this mean? Well, that means if I were to hit API/to-dos, I'm going to get the same data back every single time. So if I were to go here and just say like plus math.random, I want to show you how painful this is. So I'm going to go ahead and just say npm run build, and then I'm going to start a production version of Next.js just to show you this is going to bite you in the butt. So I'll say npm run start, and let's go here. I'm going to go to API/to-dos. I'm going to hit this. Notice that every time I refresh, I get back the same stale math random number. Like I said, this stuff sucks. This is like one of the main reasons I was so hesitant of like even using Next.js. But once you understand this, you just turn it off, right? So the idea is Next.js doesn't know that this is like a real API endpoint, like that could potentially give back dynamic data. So you actually need to say no store inside of this function. This is an unstable function. They're still working on getting this like stable. But basically now, if I were to go ahead and say npm run build, you'll see that this changed from a circle to a lambda character. Okay, so now npm run start, this is now a dynamic endpoint. It means that every time you hit it, it's actually going to rerun the code like a normal API would. Now, why do they choose to do this approach? I honestly have no idea. I think it's the dumbest thing they've ever done in a framework where you have an API endpoint, but it caches all your data forever. These are some of the things I've been super critical about with Next.js. Again, this doesn't fix our issue with our main index page. This is still static. So when we're building our Next.js application, it's going to still basically fetch data when it's building from the API, and then it's going to render out this HTML file. It's going to put a random token in it. All right, so we go ahead and run this and then go back and notice that this, no matter how many times I refresh this page, it's not going to show us the latest data because, again, everything is cached in Next.js, which is highly disappointed in that. But yeah, so again, how do you fix this issue? Now, I would say you can't even add like a cache no store here, because when you build this, it actually throws an error because it's trying to actually fetch data from this API endpoint. So what you need to do is, again, just put no store at the top of this. And then when you build this, it'll treat this as a dynamic endpoint, and it won't try to fetch data when it's building, and it won't also cache it. So I went off on a tangent there. I was talking about optionality, and I think I kind of just showed why Next.js is not a good framework because of the way caching works. But the optionality is there. Once you get a handle on it, once you understand how it all works, you can turn on or turn off the caching, which is great depending on the needs that you have for your components or for the page that your users are currently on. Maybe you do want to cache stuff for 30 seconds. Maybe you do want to cache stuff for 5 minutes. Again, something else that you might not even realize is that I just showed you a way to statically generate pages where you can basically, kind of like Gatsby, where it fetches data when you're building. You can just do this, and then when you run npm run build, it's going to basically fetch data from an API. This could be like a CMS if you wanted to. So like, I don't know, say like my CMS API. You could fetch all your data from a CMS and have this all be statically generated pages, right? So you have the option to do that if you want. So again, another thing I want to mention about optionality is, let's say you had a page that had a ton of data and you had the need to show some other things dynamically. Because the topic is about optionality, what you can do is you can actually stream in subcomponents. If I go down here and say async function my to-dos component, and then in here, what we're going to do is just make a div, and I'm actually going to move this fetch. I'm going to move it out. I'm going to put it at the top of this file here, and then we're going to render out that data hello. Okay, and so the main difference is, let's say you have a landing page, you have maybe 10 or 12 different sections, but in one of those sections, you need to dynamically fetch some data. Okay, so you don't want to have to hold up the entire render of the page because of this one little my to-dos component. Instead, you want the page to render as normal. Let's just pretend like we have a bunch of sections, because then we have 7 sections, and on the very last section, maybe it's like a contact form or something, we want to go ahead and just put that my to-dos component. And the way you can kind of stream stuff in with Next.js is you just wrap it in a suspense boundary. You can also do like a fallback, and I could just say loading ... Okay, and so this page is going to load, and this stuff is all going to be statically basically rendered in an HTML file. It's going to be really fast to send over the wire, but this little section right here, that is going to be fetched in and streamed from the backend, so that when the page first loads, it's super fast. And I'll go ahead and say npm run build just to show you that this is still going to be a dynamic endpoint, because we have a component here that has unstable no store, and that kind of bubbles up the tree all the way to the page and tells the page that, hey, you need to keep this thing dynamic because we have a component in here that is dynamic. So just to really drive this point home, I'm going to add a little 1-second timeout so that we can actually see this loading thing happen, because I think it's going too fast. Go ahead and refresh this page. And as you can tell, as I refresh the page, all this stuff loads over really fast, but this one component, it comes in with the loading. Optionality. You can opt in to making things faster as needed by basically just wrapping stuff in a suspense boundary. Now, a really important section that you should look at and make sure you understand is this route segment config. This is another example of optionality, and some of these are really important to understand. So if you wanted to change how one of your endpoints works, you can just go ahead and export a constant called runtime, and you can literally put edge here. And that's going to take this component, this page, and it's going to render it on an edge runtime across the entire globe. And that's pretty cool, because you just had to change one little line, and now you opted in to this feature. Same thing with caching. You can change preferred regions if you want to. So if you wanted a component or endpoint to run on a particular region, such as like US East 1 or something, you can go ahead and change that. You can change how long stuff caches for, I believe, with like revalidate. So if you want to go ahead and set a number here in seconds, sets the default revalidate frequency of a layout or page in seconds. So going here, I'll just set this to like 80. And so what something like this does is kind of opts you into ISR, incremental static regeneration. Is that what it's called? What this means is basically the first person that hits this page, the server is going to render this out, and then it's going to cache it for 90 seconds until after that 90 seconds, then the second user hits the page, that's when it's going to recalculate. So there's ways to like opt in and have optionality to change how caching works in Next.js. But I think if we were to add this revalidate thing to our API endpoint, I think that would be a kind of a good example. So this is basically saying, make sure this API endpoint caches for 10 seconds. And then the next request, we can go ahead and do a normal fetch request so that the math random will change. Okay, so going back here, if I go ahead and refresh, notice that it says 0.419. I do think you have to get rid of this no store, because if you use it, I don't think it's going to allow you to do that revalidate stuff. Now, the reason I'm doing npm run build and then I follow it with an npm run start is because I've seen in dev mode, sometimes the caching doesn't really act like it does in production. So you kind of have to run a real build to see how that works. Okay, so right here it's saying 0.85, right? Now it's saying 0.81. And after 10 seconds, if I keep on refreshing, the API is no longer going to cache for those 10 seconds, and then it should switch to something else. Okay, 0.58, okay? So this is all just to kind of highlight my point of like, you have a lot of options when you're using Next.js, and that's pretty cool. Like, it allows you to opt into things as you need them. As you're developing, you decide, you know what, I need more caching. Let's just go ahead and throw in a constant somewhere and export it on a page, and boom, within like 5 seconds, you have caching out of the box, right? Like I mentioned, my main gripe with Next.js is the caching, which I do think they're going to try to readdress in these coming months, hopefully. I just think it needs to be opt-in. Like, caching should be turned off on everything, and then you opt into it when you need it. Because that kind of goes with the current approach of like optionality. You keep on adding stuff on as you decide that you need it. But for some reason with the caching, they said, you know what, everything just needs to be cached because we don't think you can write a fast enough application. So I hope they reverse that. I hope they invert it and don't cache anything by default and let you pick when you want stuff cached. I think that'd be a much better user experience and it'd be a lot easier learning curve. All right, that's it. I've been talking for a while now, but I hope you guys learned at least one new thing watching my video. Have a good day. Happy coding.